insight on the topic, Human Rights, Reflections of the East and Perceptions of the West. Prof. Shad will take the floor for an hour and 15 minutes, 45 minutes for lecture and another 30 minutes for Q&A. In the course of this 1 hour and 15 minutes, we encourage active participation and engagement. As PROHAM embraces freedom of expression, we would like to provide a safe space for everyone. And that being said, let us remember that healthy dialogue thrives on mutual respect. Let's engage with open minds and kind hearts as we move forward. Please join me in welcoming Professor Emeritus Datuk Dr. Shad Saleem Faruqi.
Dr. Lin Mui Kian, distinguished members, thank you very much for the honor of this invitation. I'm actually honored as well as humbled to speak about an extremely controversial and nebulous topic that is rich with genuine and deeply conflicting but learned opinions. I wish to apologize in advance if some of you find my views too rash or imbalanced. It's actually very difficult on a topic like this to put the ocean into a bottle. May I go to slide number 3? The challenge of the topic is multiplied by the multi-dimensional and expanding concept of human rights. As you all know, in the post-World War II history, political and civil rights were the first concern and were sanctified in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights adopted by the General Assembly in 1948. The UDHR, with 2 other covenants, the International Covenant for Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant for Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, make up the International Bill of Rights, though of course there are scores of other human rights documents. I just want to point out that economic rights in the Economic, Social and Cultural Rights 1976, the Covenant, these are of special concern to many third world jurists. Next slide. There is now also the idea of a right to sustainable development. This is of more recent concern, and I'm really quite impressed by great developments in this area in many Latin American countries. A great deal of scholarship there. Constitutions have been amended to give nature a legal personality through a trust where a case could go to the court on behalf of hills and rivers and forests. A lot of developments in Latin America. There is also the idea of intergenerational justice or the rights of future generations. Asia and Africa, in addition, emphasize that an environment of peace and security is a prerequisite for the flourishing of human rights. In many Western societies, or perhaps societies even in the East, there is a lot of commitment to human rights. At the same time, there is a great deal of law and order problem. In the USA, I'm told up to 35 to 40,000 people die every year of gun violence. Now, that's obviously a danger to human rights because people should have the guarantee of walking safely on the roads, etc. Okay. Now, how do societies fare? Next slide. Slide number 5. Some societies do badly in one of the 5 categories I mentioned above, but better in others. For For example, many Asian and African nations score poorly, and I'm sorry to say Malaysia is one of them, on political and civil liberties due to the existence of preventive detention, lack of press freedom, religious persecution, torture, extrajudicial executions. However, the record of alleviating poverty and disease is often commendable. China offers a sterling example of a successful effort at redressing hunger and poverty amongst its 1.4 billion people. Malaysia too, in comparison with other third world countries, has done fairly well in tackling poverty, illiteracy, and disease. Next slide, 6. Europe and America score fairly well on political and civil rights within their borders, but indulge in horrendous violations abroad through wars, invasions, toppling of elected regimes, economic embargoes. For example, Cuba was for decades under embargo. What did Cuba do to the United States to deserve that? Economic embargoes, sale of weapons of mass destruction, export of toxic wastes, and unfair trade practices. The USA continues to enter wars to keep its war industry flourishing. Look at Palestine and Ukraine. May I go to next slide, slide 8, sorry. Could you skip slide 7, slide 8? So, because of this war in Ukraine, in Palestine, and many other theaters of conflict, human rights appear to be at a low tide today. But I have to say this to you, it's not reliable to measure the depth of the sea at low tide. We may be at low tide, it's not reliable to measure the depth of the sea at low tide. I wish to submit that despite all the regressions, this is an age of human rights, at least an age of human rights advocacy, if not human rights compliance. The quest for the inalienable rights of human beings has gained universal promises, if not universal performance. It is now generally recognized that state sovereignty is a shield against foreign aggression. It cannot be used as a sword against your own people. Abusers anywhere deserve condemnation because, in the words of Martin Luther King, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Slide 9. The idea of human rights has gained universal appeal, but there remain deep differences on the substantive details and content of the human rights ideal. This is reflected in the way many nations accede to human rights treaties, but subject to some reservations. For example, our learned president pointed out that the Suhakam statute mentions UDHR, but it also says, but subject to the federal constitution. The universal core or paradigm of human rights seems to be surrounded by a fringe or penumbra in which the great minds of the East and the West do not always meet. So I'm humbly suggesting that there is a core or paradigm where there are lots of commonalities. And I say that with optimism. At the same time, I cannot deny that there are issues at the fringe or at the penumbra where East and West do not always agree with each other. And to me, that's something that we need to work on so that the core becomes bigger and the penumbra grows narrower. Slide 10. At this point, I wish to clarify and concede that neither the East nor the West are homogeneous zones For purposes of the topic, I use the word East and West, but I'm fully aware that within each region and nation, diversity abounds and relativity of values exist. Not just within nations, at the dining table with your family, diversity abounds. And of course, the wife is always right. I have kids who tell me, no. They don't agree with me on constitutional law. They don't agree with me. So diversity is a fact of life, and it's part of the richness of human existence. When using terms like West and East, North and South, Occident and Orient, I'm using the terms to refer to ancient value systems and not to geography. Australia, for example, is situated in Southeast Asia, but has more cultural affinity with the West than with its colored Asian neighbors. Slide 11, please. Now I go to the heart of my topic, reflections of the East and perceptions of the West. Despite the homogenization and Americanization that globalization is bringing, many differences between America and Asia remain. And by America, actually, I mean America and its allies, and Asia remain. Here again, I'm generalizing. In Asia, Singapore is very different from the rest of Asia. Recognition of many core rights has not wiped away discord on a number of issues on which the reflections of the East, by which I mean the Orient, the South, and the perceptions of the West, the Occident, the North, differ considerably. I have selected 13 such areas. There may even be more. Number one, our next slide, slide 12, our socio-economic rights more important than civil and political liberties? Is food more important than freedom? Is bread more important than the ballot box? Number two, is the Asian values argument a camouflage for justifying authoritarianism? Number three, is the instrumentality of electoral democracy suitable for bringing fundamental structural changes to unjust socio-economic structures? Number four, is free market capitalism compatible with social injustice? Were human rights born, I'm on slide 13, were human rights born in the crucible of Western civilization? Can human rights be reconciled with religion, conventional morality, and custom? Can individual rights be balanced with communitarian and family values? Slide 14, must duties go hand in hand with rights? Is human dignity more important than human rights? The vocabulary of rights, or should it be the vocabulary of human dignity? Do threats to human rights emanate as much from private centers of power as from the state? Of course, the police, the military, the civil service, the local authorities violate our human rights day in and day out. The civil service is not so civil. The civil service exists to make things difficult, not to make things simple. I know that is true. But really, do private centers of power also exist? Are they also a threat to human rights? Must attention be turned to Western global dominance as a cause of the suppression of human rights and dignity in Asia and Africa? Next slide, number 15. In the field of human rights, is the moral superiority of the West a myth or a reality? And finally, should human rights be subordinated to the war against terrorism that has actually bedeviled the world in the last few decades? Okay, I go to the first one, number 16, slide 16. Socioeconomic rights versus civil and political liberties. International law actually recognizes the importance between human rights and poverty alleviation. I've jotted down only 3, there are others as well. Article 11 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, 76. Article 14 of the Vienna Declaration and the Universal Declaration on the Eradication of Hunger and Malnutrition, 1974. Slide 17. Unfortunately, much of the Western-dominated human rights dialogue tends to concentrate on civil and political liberties, not because they do not emphasize socio-economic liberties, but because they feel that civil and political liberties are the foundation on which socio-economic justice can be built. So if you have freedom of speech, you can speak out about the oppressive conditions under which you are living, and that would hopefully solve the problem. So I don't want to be misunderstood. I'm not saying they deny the importance of food and bread. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is they believe that if you give freedom of speech, the right to association, that would bring out the injustices in society. It doesn't always work that way. There is a lot of poverty even in countries like the USA. I studied there for 4 years, have been there many times. There are people who sleep on the pavements. My daughter is at the moment working in the USA. She told me, if you fall sick and you don't have good insurance coverage, after you leave the hospital, be prepared for bankruptcy. and she's speaking by, she has watched that happening. Most of the world constitutions, including Malaysia's, which are inspired by Western jurisprudence, whether that's good or bad, it's up to you, do not mention the right to food, water, shelter, health, and other socio-economic necessities of life in their Bill of Rights. We talk about freedom of association, personal liberty, and rightly so. There's no mention anywhere in the Constitution of food, water, shelter, health, and other socio-economic necessities of life in our chapter on fundamental liberties, Articles 5 to 13. Though I must confess that there are, for civil servants, a right to pension. Now, contrast this with the Indian Constitution chapter on directive principles of state policy, which is rich with socio-economic rights. Note also Africa's Banjul Charter, where there is a lot of emphasis on socio-economic necessities. Slide 18. Now, at the other extreme is the argument of some Asian developmentalists that political freedom must wait till a certain level of economic development is attained. Slide 19. I personally reject this Asian argument. Such sequencing or prioritization is self-defeating. Bread and ballot, food and freedom must go hand in hand. Human rights are indivisible, interdependent, and interrelated. I think economic development alone is not enough. Human rights development must go hand in hand with it. Political and civil liberties cannot be separated from socio-economic protections, because political and legal principles alone cannot ensure a regime of human rights. Human rights provisions in the Constitution are of no use unless they produce results. It's not form, it's functioning that matters. It's not what the law says, it's what the law does. It's not the promise, it's the performance that matters. The Constitution and laws must be evaluated functionally. Likewise, human rights development is part of socio-economic development. It's not enough to have alleviation of poverty if people are not free. So I think they must go together. Next slide, number 20, absolutism versus relativism, the Asian values debate. Is there one universal concept of human rights, or are there many conceptions? Are human rights universal, or is it that the East is East and the West is West and never the twain shall meet? The universalist perspective, which I partly support, is supported by most Western nations and by the Western educated elite of Asia. It holds that human rights values are universal because we are all human beings. We are all part of the human family. Human rights come to us from a natural law of superior validity to human laws. So law is not simply what the state says. Beyond the law of the state, there is a higher law, the natural law. Now, I'll come to that some more later on. Where does this natural law come from? I think there's a lot of difference of opinion. To many religious people, the natural law is the law of God. But to others, it could be the law of nature or the law of reason, the law of intuition. So there's a lot of difference. But there is a definite belief that the word law cannot be confined to the law of the state. Ronald Dworkin, for example, says, law consists of rules plus non-rule standards. And by non-rule standards, he's talking of a dimension of justice, equity, good conscience, and morality. He's not talking of conventional morality, but morality in terms of fairness and justice. So human rights come to us from a natural law of superior validity to human laws. I'm sure all of you, especially those who have done law, will agree that in many areas like equity, contract, even some aspects of criminal law, surely in administrative law, judges often go beyond the written law and rely on justice, equity, good conscience, principles of natural justice, even if the law may not include the rule of hearing. The courts will say hearing must be given. So I think there is law beyond law. Human rights violations have existed throughout history. This shared suffering, we all have gone through shared suffering. This justifies the tag of universality to human rights. Most international human rights treaties are widely signed and ratified. Whether it is the UDHR or the other treaties, they are widely signed and ratified, and this reflects a certain amount of universalities. There are, of course, extreme views. May I go to slide 21? The universalists allege that the so-called Asian values argument is a crude attempt to avoid compliance with international standards. I don't agree with this. I think in many areas, Asian or Eastern values are real. I'll be mentioning this later on. For example, in 1995, Singapore, by relying on Confucian values, says children have a duty to support their parents above age 60, unless the child can prove that he was abused by the parents. Now, if you were to tell an American child, you have a duty to support your parents, I'm not so sure they'll be fully in agreement. Or if you tell a parent, you have a duty to support your child, say, wait a minute, he's already 18. So I think there are some differences of opinion here, and we need to acknowledge. I have 3 older sisters. We're very close. Because of WhatsApp, we talk to each other. We share each other's problems and sufferings and joys. And I think that's only right. So there are some different standards here about what constitutes family. Family is not only husband and wife or girlfriend and boyfriend. Family is also father and mother and brothers and sisters and parents and grandparents, so on and so forth. Some universalists even allege that Asian values, if they exist at all, are inferior to Western values. Okay, slide 22. Now, what's the view of the cultural relativists? Their view is that value pluralism is an undeniable reality. Beliefs, customs, cultural and moral values are relative in nature. I was joking with you earlier, at the dining table itself, you can't get your family to agree with you on everything. So surely, when it comes to cultures, when it comes to different nations, different religions, surely there are relative values. I'm not saying one value is superior to the other. What I'm saying is there is a glorious diversity in terms of values. Rights emerge from a cultural context of societies. The values underlining rights must be internalized and cannot be imposed from above. Even more important is the fact that many Asian religions, civilization values, cultures, traditions are thousands of years old and cannot be displaced by Eurocentric documents formulated by outsiders. That's their view, that look, our civilizations are much older than yours. Don't tell us that our religions, our civilizations, our cultures can be displaced by the documents you are drafting now. Proponents of Asian values draw on the Volksgeist theory, the German theory of Volksgeist. Volks is the people, the spirit of the people. Volksgeist theory of historicism, that law is a reflection of the spirit of the people. Law is not universal. Law is relative to time and to territory. I was given the honor of drafting the Constitution of the Republic of Maldives. Maldives, as you all know, is a group of small islands. I think the biggest island, Malé, is probably as big as Newtown, PJ. You can walk from one end of the island to the other end, 1.5 hours or so. I did that. I tried to put into the Constitution a clause to say that private property could be acquired compulsorily subject to adequate compensation. I tried to borrow or steal from the Malaysian Constitution, Article 13, Clause 1 and Clause 2. The President of the Philippines said, no. In Maldives, you can't take away property. Because Maldives is a group of small islands. If you own property, that is something exceptional. People don't have private property there because the islands are rather small. For someone to have property and for the state to take it away, they say, before you take away property, kill the person first. So to them, property is absolutely sacred. But I said, you may want to build a dam, may want to collect rainwater. They have no rivers. And Malé, there are no rivers. Basically, I wish our water authorities could learn from Maldives. They have tanks that collect water from the roof. So every time it rains, the water actually doesn't go to the ground. It's collected in tanks. And that's how actually they use water for their houses. I was there for several months. I bathed with seawater every day because there was no fresh water in the taps. So I think we have to take note that different places have different value systems. So that's the Volksgeist theory. Relativists also point to the teaching of sociology that context determines content. And I just want to share this with you. When UDHR was being drafted, an American group of sociologists sent in a paper and said, be careful, don't allow Western values to influence UDHR, because context determines content. An American social organization actually warned UDHR to be careful. Slide 23. The Western claim that human rights are universal, it is alleged by some, is a thinly disguised neo-colonial argument for the perpetuation of cultural and economic hegemony by a Western civilization that is used to domination. The concept of many human rights documents like the UDHR was largely supplied by Western drafters. In 1948, when UDHR was drafted, most third world countries were still under colonial yoke. Malaysia, for example, was not independent yet. The UN had only 58 members. Now, I don't necessarily agree with this argument, but I cannot deny the fact that in 1948, much of Asia, Africa, Latin America was still under colonial yoke. Now, the next point that I was making a little bit earlier, the natural law, that is the fountain of human rights in the West, is differently understood in much of Asia. In many parts of Asia, or to communities in parts of Asia, the laws of God are regarded by many as the highest natural law, which no UDHR can replace. I want to share this with you. I've had students walking out of the class when I told them about the Malaysian Constitution, that this Constitution is the supreme law of the Federation. And any law passed after Merdeka Day, which is inconsistent with this Constitution, shall, to the extent of the inconsistency, be void. They feel that that's a violation of their religious beliefs. So I'm just trying to point out to you, while there is widespread belief in natural law, what is natural law? There is difference of opinion. In the West, many parts of the West, natural law means the law of reason, the law of intuition. Whereas in many parts of the East, natural law means the law of God. Slide 24. The Western notion of human rights tends to be individualistic largely. In the West, more and more personal autonomy rights like homosexuality are being asserted. On the other hand, Asia and Africa are more communitarian. For example, our concept of family, the rules of Fara'id. Fara'id is the inheritance rules, mandatory inheritance rules in Islam. And the Confucius law in Singapore on the rights of all parents tend to be communitarian. Religion, the West has largely freed itself from religious restraints. Whether that's good or bad is entirely a matter of your personal opinion. In the East, there are continuing efforts to find a balance between religion and morality on the one side, and individualism and secularism on the other. Civil and political rights versus socio-economic rights, slide 25. The earlier Western idea that human rights refer to civil and political rights has been enriched by the Asian and African discourse, like Africa's Banjul Charter. I really admire it. That socio-economic rights, sustainable development rights, and the rights of future generations are integral to human rights realization. I think all of us, as reasonable human beings, must be worried not only about our rights, but the rights of our children and grandchildren. When my kids were born, I used to take them to Gomba for picnics. I don't think there's any Gomba river left anymore. At one time, the Klang River used to have crocodiles. Now I don't even know if it has plankton. So I think rights of future generations should be a matter of concern. To Asian thinkers, food is as important as freedom, bread as important as the ballot box. I humbly submit, next slide please, I humbly submit that between universalism and relativism, the truth lies somewhere in between. Our thinking of human rights cannot be insulated from our religious, cultural, economic, and historical insights. The argument that there are no Asian values is a racist and ethnocentric argument. At the same time, it must be conceded that Asian values have often been used to douse the flames of freedom and to suppress the drive for justice. A middle path between these two extremes can be blazed. A human rights law with a settled core of commonalities, I also call it the paradigm, and a variable penumbra of fringe is a distinct possibility. It should be our quest to discover and enlarge this common core. Slide 27, please. The instrumentality of democracy. To most American and European observers, electoral democracy is the surest catalyst for the evolution of a regime of human rights. While this is largely true, I support democracy despite its imperfections because I don't know of a better system. I was a political science student in the USA before I did law, and Robert Dahl, the great American scholar at that time, actually wrote a book called The Myths of Democracy, MYTHS. Democracy is full of myths. For example, that parliament is a representative institution. I know it is elected representative. You must be joking. How many women are there in our Dewan Rayat of 222? About 30? That's not so representative. Women are nearly 50% of the population. Around the world, parliament is an elite institution. It's an institution of millionaires and billionaires. Anyway, I think majoritarian democracy is not always conducive to the protection of minority rights. Parliament may be elected, but not representative. Free and fair, I put that in quotations. Free and fair elections can return racists and fascists to power. Recent examples from Trump's America and Modi's India abound. Malaysia's recent GE15 seems to have polarized society on religious and ethnic grounds. Populism is not always conducive to justice, but populism is what gathers votes. Next slide, 28. The imperatives of an electoral contest may actually increase ethnic and religious tensions. And this is an important point. I personally believe in it. Democracy is good for incremental and piecemeal changes, but its ability to bring about unpopular, fundamental, structural, systemic reform is open to doubt. I was a student, I'm still a student and admirer of Indian constitutional law. When India gained freedom, they had a system of zamindari, feudal ownership of land. We also have it, but we don't talk about it. Zamindari. Rich landlords own hundreds and thousands of acres of land. Village after village they own. But the Indian constitution, in this respect, capitalistic in nature, in Article 31, gave a right to property, which can be taken away only subject to adequate compensation. The constitution was drafted by the elites in many respects. They were protecting their own property. So the government then wanted to amend that to say compensation cannot be justiciable. Compensation shall be given, but its adequacy will not be justiciable in a court of law. The court struck that down as unconstitutional. And actually it took about 20 years for the next amendment and the next amendment to be passed to say that compensation will be given, but its adequacy is not justiciable in a court of law. But in Malaysia, the law still is, in this respect, very materialistic, capitalistic. Compensation must be adequate. Okay, so I don't think any democratic society can bring about redistribution of property. I doubt it very much, because then all your contributors to your election will withdraw their contributions. Ultimately, democratic elections are an exercise in checkbook diplomacy. You need contributions from people. They will not give you the money. So I think that's a limitation of democracy. Minor piecemeal changes are possible, but not structural, systemic reform. Not entirely, though I know in some areas things are improving, for example, in gender equality. Slide number 29. Electoral democracy institutionalizes political corruption, especially in countries like Malaysia, where there is no adequate law, no law at all actually, on political donations. So this is political corruption. It grants disproportionate power to pressure groups and unfair advantages to parties and candidates with funds to mount expensive campaigns. Many democracies, such as the one in the USA, function as plutocracies, ruled by a wealthy few. Around the world, electoral democracy has proved less effective than authoritarian systems in controlling oligarchies, monopolies, and elements of the deep state. But don't get me wrong, I'm not saying abolish elections. What I'm saying is we need to understand democracy for all its weaknesses as well. Democracy is the worst form of government, except the rest of them. Except the rest of them. So it is not a very good system, but then I don't know what's the alternative. Next slide, 30. The connection between democracy and socio-economic development is by no means a necessary one. The economic rise of China and the endemic poverty of many electoral democracies in Asia and Africa are illustrative. Nevertheless, a trade-off between democracy and development is not justified. The prioritization or sequencing argument must be rejected. The human rights world needs both democracy and development. Next one, slide 31. A free market economy is often seen as a prerequisite to the promotion of a range of creative activities which are conducive to gradual strengthening of human rights. Western thinking is deeply influenced by market capitalism, individualism, and commercial rights. However, there is insufficient recognition of the need to reduce extreme social inequalities. May I go to slide number 34? I am running out of time. The origin of human rights. In our times, human rights thrived best in the West. But historically speaking, human rights were not born in the crucible of Western civilization. The widely held belief that human rights movement is the product of Anglo-Saxon Protestant culture is historically unsupportable and is based on a biased ethnocentric worldview. The UDHR was not the first document that enshrined the rights and freedoms of human rights, because the concern with the dignity of human beings was common to the religious traditions of the East. America and Europe, after centuries of gross human rights violations, adopted the human rights ethic only in the last half of the 20th century, and that too mostly as a facade. Coming back to the origin of human rights beliefs, slide 35, there is sufficient evidence that the sacredness of human dignity was recognized by many Eastern civilizations. I can't give a broad perspective because of time, but I just want to quote the Holy Bible. It is said that man is made in the image of God. Genesis 1:27. The Holy Quran says also, we are closer to you than your jugular vein. In Surah Al-Baqarah, freeing a slave, feeding the wayfarer, the orphan and the needy were regarded as illustrations of piety and righteousness. In his last sermon at Arafah, Prophet Muhammad reminded his followers, your lives and your properties are as sacred as this day of the Hajj. In 1446 years ago, Prophet Muhammad said, all mankind is from Adam and Eve. An Arab has no superiority over a non-Arab, nor a non-Arab has superiority over an Arab. A white has no superiority over a black, nor a black has any superiority over a white, except by piety, taqwa, and good action, Al-Bukhari. And I was really amazed to read that at the entrance to the Faculty of Law at Harvard University, there is this verse taken from Surah An-Nisa. O you who believe, stand out firmly for justice, as witness to Allah, even as against yourselves, or your parents, or your kin, and whether it be against rich or poor, for Allah can best protect both. I could say much also about Buddhism, Sikhism, and Hinduism. Let me just say, the duty to be just, to respect the rights of others, was known to the ancient world. The West adopted this ethic only after World War II, after centuries of brutal violations, slavery, genocide, many of which continue today, but in other disguises. Next one, slide 38. Many Western legal systems hold it as a cardinal principle of political faith. The law and morality, the state and religion must be clearly demarcated. This brand of militant secularism too can be militant, just like religion can be militant. Denies any significant place for religious considerations in the human rights discourse. In contrast, 33 nations of the East, as compared to 9 of the West, adopt a state religion. Blasphemy is an offense in 30 Eastern societies compared to 10 Western societies. In most Asian and African societies, slide 39, the religious basis of human rights is recognized, and the political demand for personal liberties is subjected to religious, conventional, and moral considerations. For example, homosexuality is an offense in 71 Asian and African societies, compared to 0 European legal systems. As a teacher of LLB London many years ago, we used to have a topic on law and morality. And we used to do John Stuart Mill, that the law has no right to punish immorality unless it causes harm to others. So that was the criterion. The law has no business to interfere in private morality if it causes harm to others. But in answer to Stuart Mill's, Lord Devlin said, not Denning, Devlin, Lord Devlin said that actually there is in every society a public morality, which it should be the duty of the state to enforce. So there are differences of opinion on the issue of whether public morality should or should not be enforced by the law. Slide 40, the modern secular discourse on human rights should not ignore the religious convictions of the population. Thank you, sir. Thank you. Let's put it here. Thank you so much. Water is a human right, isn't it? Thank you so much, sir. The modern secular discourse on human rights should not ignore the religious convictions of the population in its formulation of the inalienable rights of human beings. Religious persons will not sacrifice their most firmly rooted convictions at the altar of the new religion of human rights. Human rights also is a form of a religion, a new religion. If law is to be internalized, as it must be, it must not depart too far from the moral values of society and its entrenched customs. It must be noted that in all religions, there is much that will support human rights. In all religions, there is much that supports human rights, human dignity. Ultimately, it's a matter of what we are looking for. Many people are searching for justification to hate others, and they will search for it and they'll find it in their religion. They impose their own weaknesses, superimpose their weaknesses on their religion. So I humbly wish to say there is in every religion much that is good, much that is transcendental. It's a matter of what you are looking for. Ultimately, it's a matter of what we are looking for and how we choose the interpretive possibilities. We need a shared criteria between rational secular morality and religious convictions. Let us not forget that practicing one's religion is itself a human right. If I tell someone, be rational, don't follow your religion, he may well tell me, say, but wait a minute, following my religion is also a human right. Asian governments, more than Western, suffer this dilemma. Can the authority of government and the obligation to obey its directives be persuasively defended in purely secular terms, or is a religious underpinning required? I wish to propose to you I wish to share you my experience. As a student of constitutional law and a lecturer, I used to rely on the Perlembagan Persekutuan to try to talk of some ideals. I found a great many people were rather skeptical. So I changed my strategy. I talked of tolerance, I talked of human rights, and I started quoting also from the Quran and the Hadith. Suddenly I had a greater audience. So I think some of these ideas need to be internalized if they have to be practiced, and there is no harm of trying to rely on any possible source of authority actually to support our arguments. I was quoting here from Kent Greenwald, Religious Convictions and Political Choice. Then individual rights versus collective welfare. The Western version of human rights tend to emphasize the individual and his rights, his or her rights against society. The blasphemous satanic verses by Salman Rushdie is a case in point. Asian societies, on the other hand, subject individual rights to religion, morality, collective welfare, and communitarian and family values to a much larger extent. Slide 43, legal attitudes towards blasphemy, pornography, sedition, treason, lèse majesté are illustrative. I know that many of you will say, why should blasphemy be punished? There should be freedom of speech. Well, I want to ask you this, why should treason be punished? Why should sedition be punished? If treason and sedition can be punished because you are disloyal to your state or disloyal to the institutions, then to those who believe in religion, disloyalty to the religion is also treason. So I think we have to be uniform in our application of standards. Ultimately, whether blasphemy should be an offense cannot be justified by reason or rationality. It has to be, it's a matter of faith. At the same time, same rules will apply to treason. If someone says his state is doing wrong or his state is poorly organized, then why should he be punished for condemning the state or even fighting against the state? Since 1995, Singapore law compels children to support their aged parents Islamic law, wasiyat, wills. Muslims can give only 1/3 of their property by way of wills. The bequeathable 1/3, 2/3 must go by way of inheritance, because the principle is you can't cut off your wife and children. I've read that many Westerners, they will give 1 million ringgit to the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. They'll give $10 to their wife or to their husband. So Muslims have limitations there because the family is important. In many Asian societies, the law on divorce puts many procedural hurdles against quick divorces. Divorce is a personal choice. At the same time, there are procedural hurdles. In Asian legal systems, the legislature and the courts view it as one of their essential functions to superintend the moral life of the community. May I go to 46? Human rights or human dignity. Western theory emphasizes human rights. Many Asian scholars prefer to use the term protection of human dignity as the primary aim of the law. The vocabulary of rights is shunned on the ground that the assertion of some rights may be incompatible with the preservation of human dignity. For example, the rights of sex workers, some forms of dressing, adult films, pornography, etc. are subject to regulation. Slide 47. In Western theory, there is emphasis on protection of the individual against the power of the state. Actually, much of Western theory on human rights sees the state as the violator. And indeed, the state is. But in Asian societies, the threat to the rule of law are believed to emanate as much from private centers of power as from the state. Please tell me, domestic abuse, ill treatment of domestic servants, manufacturers putting poison into our foods, into our cosmetics. Now, these are all violations by the private sector. Companies importing toxic waste, Malaysian companies importing toxic waste from Australia, of course, for economic benefit. Now, these are all private sector violations. Then human rights, next one, human rights international. I'll just take 5 more minutes. Human rights and international centers of power. Much has been written about the danger to human rights from the dominant power of oppressive, authoritarian ruling elites within nation states. Without doubt, they are a threat to human rights. The state within a state, they are a threat to human rights. But very little attention is given in contemporary human rights discourse to Western global dominance as a major cause of the suppression of human dignity. Then slide 49, moral superiority of the West, myth or reality. I've already talked about this. Our civilizations, Chinese, Indian, Persian civilizations, actually African civilizations had a great deal to say about human rights, about human dignity, about tolerance, about freedom of religion. But I know that these are not emphasized. Our universities are primarily West-centric. I taught jurisprudence for many years, Datin. H.L.A. Hart says in his book, the concept of law. He didn't say concept of English law. He said concept of law, because obviously English concept of law is universal. But if I were to write a book on Islamic concept of law, I have to add the word Islamic. Because Islamic concept of law is narrow, sectarian, whereas the British concept of law is universal. I mean, so the assumption goes. I never taught in jurisprudence Hindu concept of law, Chinese concept of law, or African concept of law, because these are all sectarian. So, moral superiority of the West is a myth, actually. There's a great deal that our civilizations can also teach the world. And slide number 51, human rights and the war against terrorism. The savagery involved in killing, maiming, beheading, or rape of innocent civilians by terrorists and militants in many countries is clearly a crime against humanity. What happened on October 7 was clearly wrong. At the same time, what is happening is totally disproportionate. After that, the bigger picture is rather different. Terrorism is not new. Terrorism didn't begin with September 11. There were many, many incidents of greater terrorism before September 11, but they went unmourned. Terrorism is not new. Secondly, state terrorism is no less despicable. I'm on slide 52. State terrorism is no less despicable than terrorism by non-state actors. I was told that during the presidency of the previous president, every Monday there used to be a meeting to decide as to who would be the victim of bombing or killing during the week. So they decide targeted killings, they call it, targeted killings. So where will the targeted killings take place? That too is terrorism. I'll go to my conclusion. I'll just take 2 minutes here. The Western concept, slide 57. The Western concept of human rights stands out beautifully for its individualism, its support for freedom of contract, its emphasis on the right to property, its preference for civil and political liberties over economic rights. Socio-economic rights, I'm sorry, it should be socio-economic rights. The West sees human rights as consisting largely of limitations on the power of the government. It proceeds on the assumption that human rights are universal and transcendental. In contrast, Asian formulations treat human rights as tools for higher ends. Asians place individual rights in the backdrop of communitarian goals, argue strongly for alleviation of poverty, and place emphasis on economic rights side by side with political liberties. For example, the Indian Constitution has a chapter on rights as well as duties. In Asian writings, there is increasing recognition that not only the structure of the state, but private centers of power within the national state pose a threat to human rights. Additionally, there is a strong belief that multifarious Western-dominated international institutions like the World Bank, IMF, and other such institutions pose a continuing threat to human rights in Asia and Africa. Many Asians see the Security Council as a racist institution, as an institution basically of the victors of World War II. So there are these differences. Slide 60. These differences should not, however, be exaggerated. Differences between East and West. A large core of shared values also exists between the East and the West, and between national and international formulations of the rights of human beings. The challenge for all of us is to search for this common core, to expand this core, and to bridge the gap between theory and reality. As I said earlier, putting things in a document, UDHR, is not enough. UDHR is not enforceable nationally. It is not enforceable internationally because of the veto. So I am sorry to say this to you, most of the countries prosecuted for crimes against humanity have been African and Asian countries, except for Bosnia, where there was a prosecution. Most of the other prosecutions by the International Criminal Court have been of Asian and African dictators. So at the moment, human rights in UDHR and other such beautiful documents are really unenforceable. Internally, they are unenforceable because of the dualist theory of law. Internationally, they are unenforceable because the Security Council allows a veto, and therefore nations like Israel escape from any censor. Finally, slide 62, I want to mention this. The era of human rights is creating, I apologize if this hurts you, a deluge of human rights claims. I know that we need to talk of human rights. At the same time, there is also a deluge of human rights claims. I've had students asking me, what about my human right to smoke? I say, yes, indeed, you have a human right to smoke, but please inhale, do not exhale. So human rights, the word human rights are being used now actually for every ordinary civil rights claim. Is there a personal autonomy right to refuse COVID vaccination, as happened actually in many cases around the world, Does personal liberty include homosexuality, same-sex marriage, euthanasia, cross-dressing, attempted suicide, drug taking? Are pornography and blasphemy part of free speech? Due to the deluge of human rights claim, some authors are suggesting that maybe not all rights are human rights. The concept of human rights should be narrowed down. They distinguish between human rights and ordinary civil and political claims in the penumbra. So don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that people should not have the right to homosexuality. I would rather call it the right to privacy. And instead of calling it a human right, which many of us will respond to with disgust, why not just make it a right to privacy, an ordinary civil and political right? May I just give just one last example? As a worker for a university, I have a right to a loan, I have a right to holidays. Are these human rights? I have a right to a car loan. Is that a human right? Or should we distinguish between human rights, which are these core paradigms, or ordinary civil and civil claims? Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Please take a seat on the center stage, sir. We will proceed with Q&A session.
Okay.
Now we open the floor for discussion and Q&A session with Professor Shad. If you have any questions or thoughts to share, please raise your hands. We will collect 2 questions first. Yes, please.
Thank you, and thank you, Prashad, always so inspiring. So my question is more on a Malaysian context. So as we see that Malaysia, on one hand, I would like to say that, you know, we move towards to comply with the Western standards of human rights. For example, we abolished the other side, we have states that constantly seeking to implement hudud law, or or more on the crow side of law that universalists will deem. So my question is this: so when Prashad, you mentioned that, you know, law of gods or religion law is also a part of human rights, as we would believe in Asian context, and we see so much tension nowadays or actually, I mean, Malay in general. So between these clash of values, do you think it is something that we can bridge in Malaysian context? Or would you say that hudud law or Sharia law should be interpreted to align with the universal standards, which in a way that it's beneath or under universal standards? Thank you.
I agree with you. I said that earlier also, that in the area of civil and political liberties, the Malaysian legal system has a great deal of improvement to make. Malaysia has done, however, fairly well in the area of socio-economic rights, education, poverty alleviation. Now you are coming to the issue of religious rights. Please bear in mind that in politics, people make demands or make suggestions because that would win them votes. They don't necessarily believe in what they are proposing. From day one, actually, Islam was the religion of the Federation, but the states that were given the power to enact criminal laws against the precepts of Islam, those are the words used in Schedule 9, List 2, Paragraph 1, states can punish offenses against the precepts of Islam. It also said very clearly that there would be limitations. One limitation is the law would apply only to Muslims. Second limitation was it will not apply to any matter in the federal list. And another limitation not well known of is or covered by federal law, or covered by federal law. And a very important limitation, again, not well known, is and the jurisdiction of the Sharia courts shall be as determined by federal law. It is in Schedule 9, List 2, Paragraph 1. The jurisdiction of the Sharia courts shall be determined by federal law. Now, my learned professor, Professor Soti, is here. Perhaps he could help me on this. To me, jurisdiction refers to at least three things. Number one, who can be prosecuted? Number two, what can be prosecuted? And number three, what penalties may be imposed. In other words, the powers of the states to punish Islamic offenses must be determined by federal law. The federal law is the Sharia Courts Criminal Jurisdiction Act 1965, which says that the Sharia courts and the the state assemblies can only impose the penalty of 365, 3 years jail, 6 strokes of the cane, 5,000 ringgit fine. So that is the law. Now, I know Kelantan and Terengganu passed hudud offenses. That was more for political purposes. Their aim was to say to their electorate, look, these are not good Muslims. We are good Muslims. And therefore, see, we are doing what needs to be done. After that, they kept quiet. They never actually went to the courts to challenge the matter any further. So, my personal view is this, that all religions, including Islam, are capable of interpretations that are dynamic, that take note of the realities of the situation. As I was mentioning to you earlier, much depends on what you are looking for. It is perfectly possible. I'm just giving you one example. I cannot give more, though I have many examples, because I don't have a tawliya. You know what is a tawliya? I don't have the authority to speak about Islam. My interpretation would be illegal. But I'm just giving you an example. I mentioned to you about fara'id, the law of inheritance. In Islamic law of inheritance, daughters get half of what sons get. I have 3 daughters, I have 2 sons. The oldest child is a son, the youngest is a daughter. I don't want my daughter to get anything lesser than my son. Now, I have two ways of looking at it. One is, look, God knows best, and so I'm just going to follow my religion. But on the other hand, I have another way of looking at things. I examine whatever I can in the Sharia, and I find that there is a way out, there is a possibility. I'm allowed to give hiba, gift, in my lifetime. And this is what I intend to do. I'm not violating the religion, but at the same time, I fully, I acknowledge this. This is my personal opinion, because I don't have a right to give any opinion on the Sharia. I feel that there are many, many possibilities of interpretation. It depends on what you are looking for. So my answer to you would be this: I don't think that's going to be possible in this country. Don't forget that literacy rate is about 92%. In the last 60 years or so, Malay Muslim education has arisen. A lot of people have studied abroad. And I don't think what you are fearing will be possible. But of course, politically, it is part of populism.
Thank you, Prof. Can we have a second question?
Do I have a right to silence?
Thank you, Prof. It's always a pleasure to listen to you. But I wanted to take this opportunity to sort of feed off from the question about religion and the use of religion and the interpretations by religion. I just want to emphasize two things. I think as long as religion is used for public policy, then all of us have a right to comment and critique it, whether you're a Muslim or whether you are a person of another faith, including, you know, people who do not believe there's a God. So in Malaysia, I feel quite strongly, and that's what we try to do, Prof, as you know. We critiqued misinterpretations and the wrongful interpretations of religion that was harmful to society. That's one comment I wanted to make, that we have a right to be critical of any use of religion, whether you're in India, which is happening in India right now, whether you're in Sri Lanka, they're using Buddhism, you know, and in our country, and even in America, because, you know, the Christian religion is used, and that is why reproductive rights were withdrawn from women. The second comment I wanted to make, and not more a question, would you agree, when we look at Western and Eastern, for me as a feminist, as a women's rights activist, I've never seen, whether you're from the north, south, or west, or south, wherever you're from, the one common value that I see on all these societies is patriarchy. Yeah. All of us have treated women badly, right? So it's not just a Western value, because in fact Asian values can be quite detrimental to women, but so are Western values. So I just want, would you agree with that? You know, that whether it's East or West, when it comes to women, treating women, you know, people of a lower caste, you know, it's the same. Thank you.
No, I agree with you on that. Patriarchy has run like...
Equally, we discriminate equally in that way, you know. We discriminate equally. Wherever you are, we discriminate women equally.
Sure, I agree with you on that. Patriarchy has been part of human history for thousands of years, and I think it certainly is the time to change that. My main difficulty is this, that to the average person, whether Hindu or Muslim or Christian, to the average person who believes in religion, the fear is this is the will of God. Yes. I was at UIA for many years, University of Islam and Tarabangsa, on secondment, and often when we had arguments, ultimately the argument ended like this: okay, this is what God says. And you know, it's very difficult to answer that. In other words, you are a human being, your wisdom is limited. That wisdom is higher. So what I try to do as a Muslim is, only partly successful, I try to search whatever I can in readings, whether Indonesian readings, Indonesian writings, or local or abroad, and see if I can find an interpretation that suits my notion of what right should be. I gave you one example about my daughters and my sons. If at all my son should get lesser than my daughter, because he's the oldest, he has had benefit of parental care, his children, my grandchildren, they will call me up and say, they call me Nana. Nana, I'm going to Singapore for a debate. Can you sponsor it? And I say yes. My daughter is not yet married. So my son and his children have had benefits from the parents for many, many decades. Not my daughter. So that's what I try to do. But I fully agree with you that patriarchy is something that has been part of human history, and we need to put an end to it. But how to do it, I think that's the challenge. To me, the way is more creative interpretations. In constitutional law, for example, I should give the credit, Gopal Sriram used to talk of prismatic interpretations. In other words, the light hits the prism, comes out on the other side in many beautiful colors. So constitutional law can be interpreted creatively, and I think the same thing it needs to be done to religious texts as well. Justice 200 years ago or 1400 years ago may not be the same as justice today, and I think we need to adopt new and newer interpretations. So that's my search as a student, as a teacher, as a parent, as to what I can find that is more suitable. But I fully acknowledge that there is this issue which is difficult to tackle. When someone says, but wait a minute, you are just a human, your wisdom is limited, this is the wisdom of God.
Thank you very much, Professor, for your take on the gender equality and religion. I'm afraid we only have time for 2 questions because... go. Okay.
Right. Sorry, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for that lovely presentation, Prof. Always enjoy when you speak. Just on the area of sustainable development, which I took a lot of interest in when you spoke about it, and that it was constitutionally now provided in various Latin American countries. Now, just yesterday, my colleague was informed that right in front of his house, there was this green lung, just in Petaling, he lives in Petaling, there's this green lung, beautiful trees, long, been there for years, and it just got wiped out. And suddenly from a greenery to clean, healthy environment is now devastated by open air, which now brings in a lot of heat and trouble to the community in that area. In the Malaysian context, we have got lots of legislations on environmental protections. The states are obliged to provide for it, the local authorities are provided to ensure there is compliance. Unfortunately, over the years, this has eroded. You can see lots of the green lung being taken away, environmental deforestation taking place and so forth. That's affected our lives, our interests, our way of water supply and so forth. Now, taking the leap on what you've mentioned earlier about constitutionalizing environmental protection, would that be of assistance if our constitution is amended to include such a right? Sorry, I didn't introduce myself. I'm Joy Apukutin. I don't represent the Malaysian Bar, but I'm from the Malaysian Bar. Thank you.
You want to take one more question first?
Yeah, that's just one.
Let me answer that. There are some judicial decisions which interpret the concept of life, liberty, and law prismatically. So life is not only being alive, the animal existence. Life also means dignity of life. Life means the necessities of life. So Article 5, Clause 1 says, no person shall be deprived of his life. Apologies, his, it says his. No person shall be deprived of his life or liberty, save in accordance with law. So life is the necessities of life. Then liberty includes the right to go to the court, to seek remedies for our rights. And the word law includes not just laws passed by Parliament, but laws that are proportional. So there is this possibility, but I have to confess to you, only just a few judges are indulging in this kind of creativity. Most of the judges interpret the law literally, grammatically, keyhole interpretation. So life means being alive. In fact, death penalty has been challenged as a violation of Article 5, and the court said no, death penalty is legal. Even mandatory death penalty was held to be legal in a number of cases. So I have to confess to you that the Constitution on the issue of sustainable development is inadequate. There are some suggestions that perhaps Article 5, Clause 1 be amended slightly to include in life the idea of sustainable development. I personally think we should not do it indirectly. I think we should have a clear amendment to Part 2 of our Constitution to say that citizens individually and collectively have a right to sustainable development. And as I did hint to you, in many Latin American countries which are providing leadership, rivers, forests, hills, nature, the word nature has been given locus standi, to be able to go to the court, but through trustees. So I think we need to do that. The other factor is this, and this is something that I remember very distinctly. When Asian societies became independent, many of them, Malaysia is one of them, India another, I think poverty was the biggest issue. Lack of development was the biggest issue. For example, in the first Indian 5-year plan, one of the items was that the government of India will dig 50,000 wells to provide water to the villages. And that program was successfully implemented. So development was the need of the hour. Sustainability was not talked about. I remember attending a seminar where an African delegate was listening to this sustainability talk, and he smiled and said, can I ask you, can you export some of your problems to us? Environmental degradation, can you export some of that to us? Because he was joking. He wanted some development, and if that development causes environmental degradation, doesn't matter. So he wanted us to export some of the environmental pollution, the industrial pollution, to his country. So I think that was part of the problem, that in Malaysia up to now, development was the issue, cutting down the forest, replacing them with a felda plantation in rubber, a felda plantation in palm oil. When I first heard of these plantations, I was very impressed. I thought that was really remarkable. But now more and more I read about it, And I think that was a great environmental, environmentally they were not necessarily beneficial for society. So I think that's one problem, that development was the priority, sustainability and social responsibility was not adequately a motivating factor. Further, I want to mention this too, the problem of corruption is there. I live in Taman Sapute. When we bought the house, my wife and I bought the house, Taman Sapute had a small stream. It was just a small stream, but it was a stream. There were lots of hills, there were lots of trees, and that was part of the attraction of Taman Sapute. Over the years, many of the hills were taken away. The stream has become a drain. The hills are gone, the trees are gone. Multi-story blocks have come up, partly because of corruption. Under the law, we residents have a right to be heard if hills are to be taken away, if development projects are to be sanctioned, if development projects are to be permitted. They do it only formally, not sincerely. They'll put up a notice somewhere near a road, on a piece of stick, they'll put up a notice, such development is proposed. And when we object, actually, the impression we get is the decision is already made. The decision to develop is already made. We were invited to offer objections only in a very procedural, formal way. And we have not been able to stop any development in Taman Sapute. Taman Sapute is not so bad. I had the same experience in Klang. There used to be a very nice children's corner, and my children were very small. I was very attracted. Within 2 years after we moved in, the children's corner was developed into terrace houses. So I agree with you, this is what is happening. It's partly because of corruption. The lack of independence of the corruption agencies, and I think the fact that politicians are appointed to these top posts, there is no local authority election. In my view, I would be not so sad if there was no state election. To me, more important is local authority election. But there are no local authority elections. So these combination of factors, first of all, the law is weak, and secondly, there is the issue of corruption, there is the issue of no local authority elections. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, a big round of applause for Professor Datuk Challenge. Thank you. We shall now take a short break of 5 minutes and we will reconvene. We will now transition to the next agenda, which is the panel discussion.